Oke, selamat malam kawan-kawan semua. Hari ini kita kembali ke Perspicere diskusi yang keenam. Kita akan berdiskusi soal platonisme atheistic atau Atheistic Platonism bersama dengan Steinhart, seorang uh, profesor filsafat dari William Paterson University. Jadi ya, kita sangat beruntung untuk bisa kedatangan Eric pada malam ini. Dan tanpa berlama-lama lagi, saya akan memperkenalkan Eric dan kita akan masuk ke dalam diskusi mengenai Platonisme ateistik ini. Welcome, Eric. Glad to have you here today. It's 8 p.m. In Indonesia, so it's very wonderful to discuss this stuff's philosophy at late night.
Okay, very good. Good to be here.
Yeah. So, would you mind to introduce yourself a bit first, other than that you're a professor of philosophy at William Paterson University, and I guess your interest in mostly in metaphysics and in alternatives to Abrahamic religion, and I think this atheistic Platonism is one of the alternatives.
Yeah, right. So yes, I'm a professor of philosophy at William Paterson University, and very interested in metaphysics and in philosophy of religion, and in all the complicated ways that people negotiate, the religious histories and the future of religion. Religion is certainly changing a lot and changing very rapidly, at least in the the Western world. And I don't know a whole lot about Indonesia, but maybe it's changing there too, or maybe it's just more complex, because the history of colonization, as well as other historical features and geographical features of that region, right? So many, unlike America, where it was just sort of settled by European Christians, and then you have a complex historical legacy there too of religion, as people from Africa and indigenous peoples were came into the society in different ways. So human society is religiously complex usually, and I'm very interested in that complexity. I'm very interested in the ways that religions are changing, and new things are emerging. So I'm in America, I'm American, and so a lot of my thoughts kind of come from that world. But maybe it's also very interesting in other parts of the globe too, in the Pacific Rim, right? That the America shares with Asia. In some sense, there's a common Pacific culture, right? And I'm very interested in that. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you. So just like what you said, maybe there's a bit differences in the way the Americans and Indonesia perceive religions, but funny thing, Christians here are very Americans. So yeah, maybe we can discuss it sometime later. Anyways, again, thank you so much, Eric, for taking your time here. Before we go into the artistic patterns and stuff, I want to ask some um, personal questions, but not so personal. So, what makes you into philosophy? Yeah, like I read somewhere online that you said that you were grew up as a evangelicals, right? Is there something related to that upbringings? Because me myself, I once was studied philosophy for apologetic means, but instead I questions many stuffs in evangelical Christianity myself. So yeah, can you share yours
Sure.
experience?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a very religious household. Most of my male relatives are ministers. They're preachers, in very uh, conservative evangelical Protestant Christianity. White evangelical Protestantism, and yet we came from a very strange background, probably not quite recognizable. The Pennsylvania Germans right? Which were Germans that came to Pennsylvania long ago, hundreds of years ago, and had their own culture. The Pennsylvania, sometimes called Dutch, but we're not Dutch. And people sometimes know the Amish. You know, they wear the hats and drive the buggies, and they don't use a lot of modern technology. So they're kind of the what people know about the Pennsylvania Dutch or Pennsylvania Germans usually. But it was a very magical culture. It's a very non-traditional kind of Christian culture in which there are lots of magical, even sort of shamanic practices. And I grew up with all that, and that got me thinking about lots and lots of things religiously, and interested in lots of different aspects of how people express kind of I don't even like the word religion, right? I mean, people do all kinds of interesting things, right? They might paint charms on furniture, or go into trances. And so what are they doing, and how do they talk about and think about what they do? So I certainly grew up with a lot of kinds of practices that, I mean, they kind of faded away. They were kind of pushed to the side as Pennsylvania German culture became anglicized, right? Dominated by a kind of English speaking. I mean, we had our own language, right? Pennsylvania Dutch. And so, yeah, I just became really interested in all those questions. And my father was a biologist as well as doing, preaching. And so he, science and religion, and it just was a very philosophical household. I mean, we would have these kinds of discussions as a matter, say, of interpreting the Bible or thinking about science and its relation to religious issues. And this was when I was a kid. And meanwhile, my mother is painting charms on furniture, and I had, shamans cast my natal chart, my horoscope, when I was, 10 years old, because that's what you did. We had ghosts in our house. We had, and none of this was unusual, right? And so, in that culture, and in some ways, I think that kind of evangelical Protestant culture is in real tension with a lot of that stuff. That you find a lot of common behaviors, divination, shamanism, ghosts, magical practices across the world, right? And then a lot of the evangelicalism just said no to these things, right? And that caused a certain lot of tension in my family, but also then as I grew older and started seeing how these things were dealt with around the world. So I'm sure if I came into Southeast Asia and someone said there are ghosts in the village or in the house or something, yeah, okay. I'm not gonna, that's not, or they're doing astrology, or there's shamanistic practices or magical amulets and things like that. I grew up in that kind of culture, and so that all those things became very interesting to me, and the traditions in the West, which the Protestant Revolution is not that old, right? I mean, it's like, okay, really 300-400 years old, and there's a much longer, much older tradition with lots of diversity of practices and doctrines. So yeah, I'm interested in all that stuff.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. Yeah, you'll find that kind of practices, of course, in Indonesia, ghost shamanism and stuff.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Especially in the eastern part of Indonesia, we're still doing those kind of things. But anyway, um, so those things interest you back when you're a kid, but
They still intrigue me.
it's still intriguing you. Yeah, it's still intriguing you right now. But what makes you decide later to delve into philosophy as a scholar?
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, first of all, I mean, sure, obviously I came from that background, but I was also very good at mathematics. And
Mm.
when I was young, computers were just sort of starting out. And so I got very interested in computers. And my first degree is actually in computer science. And I worked as a computer scientist for many years. And, computer science, obviously, the things like artificial intelligence, and I did some early work in artificial intelligence. Computer science is very, the things I was doing as a computer scientist became more and more philosophical. And so I just decided I would go study philosophy. And that's what I did.
So it starts from computer science and then goes into philosophy.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So, Eric, I want to go with the Atheistic Platonism, the book that you wrote, Atheistic Platonism, a manifesto. I came through this book of yours from Eugene. He said that this kind of topics will surprise the, the journal editors because this is a very intriguing and interesting topics. He says to me. So yeah, let's talk about atheistic platonism. I want to go with these first questions that I that I refer from your first chapters of your book. While an atheist can believe in God, an atheist can still live in God's shadows. Can you explain more what you mean here by living in these shadows, or another way to put it, the atheist, the theistic cave?
All right. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of contemporary sort of atheism in the English speaking world, or European kind of world, American world, it is a kind of Protestantism itself. And Protestantism started out challenging Catholicism and saying all these Catholic doctrines are false. We got to get away from this, idolatry. And once you start that trajectory, it can keep going. And so lots of atheists, and one of the things that surprises me about atheists is, and I'm very critical of atheism, is contemporary English speaking atheism in particular, is they just talk about God all the time. Right? They're just constantly talking about God. And this sort of bothers me. And I wonder why. I mean, I don't, there are things I don't believe in. I don't generally talk about them, and I'm not obsessed with them. So the shadows of God end up being the ways that people who say they are atheists still believe in all these Christian doctrines in particular. I don't know that you find something that strong in, let's say, Islamic atheism. Because Islam doesn't quite have the intensity of the anthropomorphic God that a lot of Christianity has. Like the guy with the white beard on a throne up in the sky, right? I mean, Christianity has much more concrete representations of God as a person, like a human-like figure, anthropomorphic. But a lot of these atheists would they would say things like, if there's no, Christian will certainly say, if there's no God, there's no objective morality. And almost every Anglophone atheist just agrees. Right. If there's no God, there's no objective morality. So morality is subjective. And you're like, well, wait a minute. Why do you believe that if there's no God, there's no objective morality? Or, if there's no God, there are all these if then chains, right? If there's no God, then this, right? And Christians say all these sorts of things, right? If there's no God, there's no life after death. And, these atheists agree. They say, right, if there's no God, there's no life after death. And so I just sort of wanted to say, wait a minute, why do you just agree with all this Christian doctrine? And I'm not the only one or the first one to point this out, that most contemporary, English-speaking atheists, and certainly Europe as well, they just accept Protestant doctrines. And they end up doing a kind of negative theology, a negative Protestant theology, where, they'll say God doesn't exist, but we preserve all the rest of the doctrines. Right? If there's no God, there's no objective morality. If there's no God, there's no life after death. If there's no God, there's no meaning in life. And they just agree with all these things. It becomes very ascetic and very monastic kind of. I think when you look at a lot of English-speaking atheists, they're like monks, right? They're like medieval monks or nuns, where they've locked themselves into a cell in a monastery, right, or a convent, and they're in a mode of negation and denial, but they're still in the monastery, right? They can't get out of this theistic cave, which is kind of this monastery, where God is still, God is present, but God is present in a negative way, right? God is present as a kind of paradoxical, but present as a kind of absence. And they think about God all the time, and they write about God all the time, and they talk about God all the time. They're often, oftentimes, if you want to find somebody who's obsessed with God, find an atheist, right? A lot of Christians or, Muslims, okay, they go to church or, they go to the mosque and then they do their thing, then they go home and they do whatever they do. But these atheists are just like God, 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 God. And so I thought, it would be good to like get away from that. If there's no God, nothing follows about morality. That would be a truly non-theistic position, right? Because you would just say, well, God doesn't have, what does God have to do with morality? Nothing. Or what does God have to do with life after death? Again, nothing. What does God have to do with meaning in life or, objective values, or why is there something rather than nothing? It's irrelevant. God doesn't have anything to do with those questions. So that's kind of where I started, and I wanted to build something that, now, I like to be pretty precise about atheism in the sense that it's a denial of theism, right? Because I sometimes perplex people because I say, like, well, I'm happy with the existence of infinitely many gods. They're just not theistic. Theism is a particular Western conception of what gods are. And it's certainly not, it's a Christian conception. It's certainly not the oldest conception. Plato, Plotinus, Aristotle, those folks don't have theistic conceptions of gods. They have different conceptions of gods. And so, and I would say, certainly Buddhists and Hindus, they have very different conceptions of gods too. So there's lots of ways to think about what a god is, and getting away from theism, right? So again, Protestant, you find these atheists, contemporary English-speaking atheists. What's a god? Well, they just agree with theism, right? Gods are theistic, right? They're immaterial thinking substances, disembodied minds, non-physical spirits. That's what a god is, because that's what Christians say a god is. And again, it's, why do you use a Christian dictionary? Why do you agree with the Christians? You can, of course, right? Christianity is an ancient and noble tradition, but it's kind of weird. They say, like, we're atheists, we're not Christians, and it's like every single word out of your mouth is a Christian word. That I find strange. So I think so I'm interested in developing alternatives to that. And I turned back to Platonism, back to the earlier Western, pagan traditions. And paganism is a loaded word, but, just saying, look, there were older and often deeper ways of thinking about these issues. So I hope that helps answers.
Yeah, it's really answered my question. So yeah, I'm agree with you that we're talking about theism, which is a very narrow conceptions of God, a Western conception, but got too much, and atheists talk too much about it. And that's why I really love the ideas of try to globalize philosophy of religion, and also to look out for the alternative of theism, the Christian conception of God. And this atheistic Platonism, I think one of the great, interesting alternatives. So um, you talk about the way atheists often accepts the Christians' conceptions of, after life after that, even morality, meaning of life, and those are called you call as the twilight atheists, and maybe they hostile towards atheistic platonism. And I wonder, why do you think should the atheists look at your proposals of atheistic platonism, and why should they be a platonist?
Yeah, I think, sure, good question. And like the Twilight atheists are the people that I say are still, obsessed with God. I mean, they still believe the theist definitions and they use theist language and conventions, even, by way of negation as a negative theology. And so, Platonism, atheistic Platonism is really threatening to that because it just says, okay, look, you just have to abandon those doctrines, right? And the idea behind Platonism was captured, kind of a cultural appropriation. I mean, it was captured by emerging Christianity. Right, there was a big cultural battle in the ancient Roman Empire. The Christians won. The pagans, I mean, the pagans never called themselves pagans. That's partly why it's a bad word, right? That was a Christian term that was used as a slur, a religious slur. Um, but I'll use it for lack of a better word. But the pagans lost, and Platonic doctrines were then incorporated into Christianity, and they were Christianized, right? And so to take them out, right, is that can be threatening to the atheists who are still really committed to Protestantism. Right, they're still really committed to Protestant doctrines. Even again, by way of negation, like saying God doesn't exist doesn't mean you're no longer a Protestant, right? Because there are lots of Christian theologians, right? This is what negative theology is. Lots of Christian theologians say, yeah, God doesn't exist, right? And the religion is about something else. And so, okay, if we try to take Platonism and separate it from how it's been Christianized and get back to its more pagan kind of roots, right? Try to think of gods the way that the ancient Romans or Greeks thought of them. Try to think of life after death the way they thought of life after death. Try to think of, values and morality according to concepts and categories that aren't Christianized, right? And also think about practices, right? Things that people do rituals, ceremonies, all kinds of things. And so that's what atheistic Platonism is really kind of about. It's about bringing forward these older traditions in ways that are not Christianized or haven't been captured by the Abrahamic religions. Um, and there's increasing number of people who are doing that on a practical level, right? But they are philosophically, philosophers haven't really gotten into this yet. Philosophy of religion is still extremely, in the West, it's extremely Christian. And so I'd like to go back to some of these older philosophies and say, what can we learn from them, right? I mean, like shamanic practices can make good sense within a Platonic framework. They won't make very good sense if that Platonic framework is theistic, right? You always have this theistic God lurking in the background, right? But yeah, so all magic, shamanism, all sorts of experiences and practices, you can start to interpret them philosophically using a Platonic framework. And of course, it's also very scientific. I mean, you've got mathematics, you've got science. You don't need to deny science, right? What you end up with is a much bigger conception of nature. So hopefully that helps answer that a little bit.
Yeah, it is. Thanks so much. So, um, I'm going to the next question, sorry. So, um, you wanna, you wanna take Platonism back, quote unquote. Let's say you wanna, the Back then, the Christians appropriated Platonism and baptized them, right? And so now you could try to utilize Platonism for another way, which is atheism. So what interests me here is that you believe it could explain many existing things, ultimate explanation. So, what are these things that atheistic Platonism can explain that once associated only with theism?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. I mean, right. So the first thing you say from that quote too is that, atheistic Platonists can agree with theists on things, right? They'll have different answers, right? And that's what I think is very interesting. So so there's an ultimate explanation for all existing things. Fine. In a Platonic context, that's generally goes by the name of the one, or being itself, right? Now, that immediately brings up an interesting point, I think, which is there are all sorts of people who will immediately say, "Oh, that's God," and that's really interesting to me because that's the moment of cultural appropriation, right? That's the moment of cultural violence, because you're going to say, "Well, no, it's not," and that difference makes all the difference in the world. Right? Because, okay, and you can start to cash it out in various details, right? The one is not a person. It's not personal in any sense. It doesn't love you or hate you. It doesn't care about you. It has no knowledge, no mentality. It's, being itself is that power which gives being to all the things that exist. And it's an absolute power, and it produces, all consistently definable mathematical objects, all possible worlds, right? This plenitude of beings, all the beings among beings, and but it doesn't. I mean, what's interesting about it is the way it doesn't fit into a monotheistic framework, because yeah, being itself is going to produce absolutely infinitely many gods in absolutely infinitely many worlds. And it's not interested in your salvation. It's not, there's no heaven or hell, right? Intriguingly, I think, the ancient Platonists, right, believed in a kind of reincarnation, which is very similar to Buddhist or Hindu doctrines. You don't get reborn here on this earth again, but you can be reborn in other worlds, right? It's often a concept found in certain types of Buddhism and certain types of Hinduism too. But right, so yeah, we want to say there's an ultimate explanation for things, but it's not God. It's not a person. It's not a mind, and consequently, what's going to come from that is going to be first of all, a very different positioning of humanity within the order of what exists, right? Humanity is not the crown of creation, the world, our universe, or not even our earth. They weren't made for us. We're here, we evolved, we're products of evolution, and someday we'll be extinct and we'll be gone, right? And, the one is going to bring new things into being. It doesn't care about us. That doesn't mean we're not valuable. It doesn't mean we don't have extraordinary value and moral value. The one produces all of that too. It just means we're not special the way that humans were. We're not central in the drama of good and evil or the drama of the universe, right? And what kinds of things do we get explained by this sort of thing? Well, I mean, if we have all possible worlds, and this is like David Lewis's modal realism. I mean, Lewis never gave much in the way of arguments for why you should believe in a plenitude of possible worlds, but a Platonist can, right? From the one and from its sort of absolute productive power of all possibilities, you're going to get all possible worlds. You're also going to get various kinds of evolutionary algorithms that start to explain things like complexity, right? Because, the unfolding of the one is an unfolding from simple to complex. And that unfolds in a mathematical way, in an evolutionary way, taking evolution to be a kind of optimization algorithm. And so you get explanations for things like, why does our universe have, like the fine tuning argument. The explanation isn't some mentality. It's just an optimization algorithm. It's the computer scientist in me. It's the algorithms. It's all algorithms. There's no need for mentality or minds. It's just algorithms. And so we can explain things like the fine tuning of the universe for life. Why are there physical laws at all? Why is there complexity at all? Um, why are there values of any kind? Because optimization creates value. So, it gives you a Platonic point of view. And my view of this is it's very rational in the sense that, right, we've got logic, we've got mathematics, algorithms, computing, and there's nothing psychological about any of this, right? It's the kind of rationality you find in a mathematical proof or in, a page of computer code, right? So I hope that answers some of those questions about what it can explain.
Yeah, it is. So it's interesting to say that uh, it is a cultural appropriation to say that the one and the Platonism as God is a cultural appropriations. And yeah, again, there is so many ways to explain morality, meaning of life, and many things in a non-theist, even in an atheistic way. So, Eric, I want to ask some details about what you said there. So, I want to go to here about why there is something rather than nothing. It's big stuff, right? It's very big, and I wonder, can you share on how the artist Platonist can explain the existence of this world, numbers and stuffs? Yeah, how can it be? How can it
Sure.
be? We always think it's God, like out of nowhere. Yeah.
Yeah. So, right. Very good. To start with your first question, like why is there something rather than nothing? There's an answer to that question that really starts with this sort of obscure medieval German guy, Jakob Böhme, who's also the sort of founder of the Pennsylvania Germans, right? The radical pietists. Um, and so he was kind of a mystic, but he emerges in Germany in a time when Protestantism, there's wars between Protestants and Catholics, and what you believe, like the Catholic Church had been there to really enforce what you believe, and now it's not, and people are just making up all kinds of stuff. Right, they're turning back to, so Burma is turning back to the alchemists, to ancient Gnostic traditions, right? And he's a weird guy. He's like a shoemaker who got an education. His family was fairly well off, but he's still basically a peasant, shopkeep, tradesman, not a peasant, but he's a tradesman, learns to read, gets all these books, and he said, why is there something rather than nothing? He, in his own kind of garbled way, says it's because the nothingness is pure negativity and it negates itself, right? So non-being negates itself, and the negation of non-being is being, right? Now this, this is a logical answer. Right? And you've got to, what Burma said is all kind of mixed up with all these images and stuff like that. But it comes out of Gnosticism. It comes out of, the Gnostic conception of the abyss, right? And the abyss kind of turning into itself and producing, this light. But Burma really takes this. And then, it's developed by Charles Sanders Peirce, an American thinker who's inspired by Burma. Right, a lot of people know it from Heidegger. Right, Heidegger wrote about the nothingness, and then the nothing itself, nothings, right, the nothing knots, right. It's been taken up by contemporary logicians like Graham Priest, who writes about this. Um, and so that's an idea that a lot of people have started to think about, right? Why is there something rather than nothing? Because to answer that question, you can't start with anything. You certainly can't start with God, right? Because then the question is immediately, why is there God? Because God is something. And so if you're going to start with nothing, right, you can't say, oh, it's because of quantum mechanics or something. Well, where did that come from? Right. So why is there something rather than nothing? You've got to start with nothing at all. And the only kind of logically consistent answer you can give then is that it can only involve nothing, and nothing negates itself. And so you get everything. I mean, that's a kind of crude way to put the logic, but it is a logical and rational kind of derivation of why there's something rather than nothing. And so, sure, you're going to get then, all right, if, nothing is sort of absolute non-existence, being itself will be absolute being, and it'll be absolute in its positivity, right? Nothing is pure negativity. The negation of the negative is pure positivity. And this pure positivity, which I don't mean it's happy and stuff like that. The positivity is logical positivity, in the sense that it's going to produce, right, the greatest consistently definable system of beings. I mean, inconsistency and contradiction is a negativity, right? So we're going to maximize all these logical values, right? Maximize consistency by producing the maximal consistently definable system of beings. And these are just going to, first of all, these are just going to be very simple. It's going to be the simplest system, which is based on a single relation, which in mathematics is membership. So you get set theory, and you get numbers, right? And you get, okay, mathematical physics, right? And people like Max Tegmark, the cosmologist, have written about that. So I like his position, right? That Platonism is a monism. We don't distinguish between the physical and the mathematical. The physical things are mathematical objects, right? And that's sometimes thought of as Pythagoreanism, but sure, right? Platonism, especially late Roman Platonism, was very Pythagorean, right? You have philosophers like Iamblichus, and they're writing books on mathematics. Um, so Right. So we get this, that than which no greater can be conceived, right? The maximal system of beings. And the one maximizes the positivity here meaning, right, the logical positivity of the beings. If it's possible, no, this isn't quite true, but if it's possible, it exists, right? And this is going to have to be a kind of complexity building thing. Like, where do you start among the beings? You start with the simplest being, and then they get more complex, and they get more complex, and you build up a cumulative hierarchy of complexities, right? And that's where you get, math and mathematical physics and all that kind of good stuff. Science. We're now doing science, right? So we've got a good mathematical foundation for science, and we've got our universe with its wonderful laws and regularities and all this beauty. We're maximizing beauty and all these other positive qualities too. So I hope that answers that.
Yeah, it is. So mm, you say that it's a monism. Like, people often think that Platonism believe in this substance dualism, but yeah, in this atheistic Platonism, you've got monism. Physics is what's physical is something that mathematics as well. Am I right?
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that's also one of the sort of signs or hallmarks of a Christianized Platonism, a theistic Platonism. I mean, Christianity has this dualism, right? You have the material world, and then you have the spiritual world, and there are two different worlds, right? The material and the spiritual, or mind and matter, right? And while Christianized Platonism says that numbers and sets and algebraic objects and things, they're ideas in the mind of God, right? And now that's with minds, right? Mathematics is part of mind. And then you get these atheists who, and this just seems like a joke to me, who think like, numbers are ideas in human minds. Because like atheists, today, atheists in the English speaking world, they take the mind of God and they make it into a human mind. It's the same theology. It's just been humanized. But a Platonist would not do that, right? I mean, no, Plato certainly didn't. Plotinus certainly didn't. And Iamblichus, one of my favorite, right? He did not. You don't have this dualism. Everything comes from the one. It's a united system. There aren't two worlds, spiritual and material, right? There's one reality. And the reality is structured in very complicated ways, for sure. But there aren't, there's no dualism. There aren't, I think this has some affinities with some aspects of Buddhism and Hinduism too, right? It's non-dual thinking, right? So hope that helps.
Yeah, it's how. Um, okay, so everything comes from nothing. We can start with God, and we need to start from nothing because nothingness negate itself. And now another question is, if everything comes from nothing, can you like explains the emergence of value? Like how could we say that something's objective in this world if we don't start with God? That's what people say, right? Even
Right.
both theists and atheists.
Right. A great agreement between these theists and atheists, right? If there's no God, there's no objective value or morality, and that expresses itself, right? For instance, in thinkers like Hume, right? And people say, oh, the fact value distinction, you can't get you can't get ought from is, or things like that, which is just, I mean, forgive me, but that's just silly. Right. It's like saying, like, yeah, you can't get porcupines from non-porcupines. I mean, if you don't put porcupines in the premises, you can't get porcupines in the conclusion. Right. This is trivial. And that's not how it goes. Right. I mean, if we're talking about value here, we're starting with logic. And of course, right, the logic of the self-negation of negation, right, is going to be maximally positive. There's a directionality. Right. This immediately gives you order relations, and order relations become relations of value. And so first of all, there has to be a concept of intrinsic value, which I follow a lot of people and say intrinsic value is a kind of complexity. Things grow more complex, they become more intrinsically valuable. They become more beautiful, they become more internally rich. And in universes like ours, eventually things like life emerges. Right. And so value will be taken up into life. Now, it's important, I think, within a kind of Platonic perspective, right? And this goes back to Plotinus, right? Is there, good and evil are relations between beings. They occur in relations between beings. There's, so there are no evil beings, no good beings either, right? Beings. So anytime evil appears, it appears as a privation of good or an absence of good or the negation of good, right? Like fire, you've got heat and you've got cold. Cold isn't a positive thing. It's the absence of heat. Darkness is the absence of light. So the Platonic, especially Platinian doctrine, is evils emerge as conflicts between goods. Right. I got the malaria parasite. I got malaria from a mosquito bite. Well, the malaria parasite wants to live. That's good for it. I want to be healthy. That's good for me. We've got a conflict now. Right. Or, the wolf wants to eat the chicken. Right. And the chicken wants to get away from the wolf. We've got a conflict we don't have a conflict between good and evil. Right. We have a conflict between goods. All right. So, I mean, the chicken wants to live. That's good for it. The wolf wants to eat. That's good for it. Right. We have a conflict between two goods because as goods get more diverse, they're going to enter into all kinds of interactions and you get conflicts between the goods. But one Platonic doctrine, because it's a monism, right, is that the conflicts between goods will be resolved in some way at a higher level of complexity. And this happens, And so, we could get into the sort of logic behind, like if you've got being, right? If you've just got a kind of descriptive logic, yeah, it's hard to get deontology. It's hard to get ought. But obligation operators. I'm going to just be really quick here because it's kind of technical and I don't want to get into it, right? Yeah, I mean, Immanuel Kant showed how you get ought from is, the categorical imperative. I mean, that's straightforward. And so as soon as you have, now maybe you need modality, maybe you need possibilities, right? And so I have two possible courses of action, right? I could lie or not lie. And so I asked myself, well, which one of these possible courses of actions is universalizable, right? Without contradiction. That's what universalizable means, right? And of course, if everybody lies, then that means like nobody can believe anything anybody says. And so truth itself is gone. And if truth is gone, then there are no lies either. So universalizing lying contradicts itself. That was a 30-second summary of the categorical imperative. And okay, it's complicated, but that's exactly how one goes from is to ought. So you ought not to lie. You ought to tell the truth because telling the truth is universalizable without contradiction. And that's logic, right? Now it's modal logic, deontic logic, fine. And that's technical. And there's people, including me, who've, written professionally about that. But in life, I mean, life is very interesting because life, people say, this is one of the things that gets me angry with atheists. They look at evolution and they say it's valueless, or it's just conflict, or it's just evil or destruction. And of course, they have a very Christian concept of what a value creating system should look like. And evolution doesn't look like that. Richard Dawkins, I mean, the guy is supremely Christian when it comes to thinking about the value of evolution. He just might as well be in church. And it's too bad. Because as soon as you look at evolution and you see organisms coming into conflict, right, you see things like the categorical imperative emerge at microscopic levels, right? I mean, because things like the categorical imperative or deontic logic more generally, right, they will manifest themselves in game theory. All right. So, and again, I'll try not to be too technical, but organisms, right, can start to play games with each other. And I mean this mathematically, game theory, like the prisoner's dilemma, right? They start to trade and you start to see, right, algae and fungi start to trade, right? Fungi and trees start to trade. The other plants, the photosynthetic plants, are like, look, I can make carbon. You need carbon. You can make nitrogen. I need nitrogen. Let's trade. And they start to trade. And strategies like the game theoretic prisoner's dilemma strategy of tit for tat emerges. It evolves. Right? Evolution finds this because this is an optimal way of solving a coordination problem. And you find all these systems of value and morality emerge because greater cooperation is going to lead to greater fitness, right? Okay, I've got my nitrogen, you got your carbon. It's good for both. But when goods come into conflict, goods can also learn to cooperate, right? I mean, conflict is just the first way different goods encounter each other. And so you start to see organisms cooperate and they start to implement various game theoretic strategies and they start to implement things like the categorical imperative. And as you get greater complexity and you get brains and minds and things like that, you get even more complex moral systems. And so, but this emerges because evolution is an optimization algorithm. Why is evolution an optimization algorithm? Because, okay, ultimately, the self-negation of non-being is maximally positive. So, I mean, okay, a lot of long stories in there, right? But that's kind of the gist of it, right? It's very strange to me that anyone would look at our universe and say there's no value there. or it's really arrogant and narcissistic to me for somebody to say, well, all the value comes from human brains. Like there was no value in the universe before humans, like there's no value without humans. That seems to me to be um, just like humans aren't that important, man. And again, that comes from taking the idea of God and just putting it into the human mind, right? Because the Christian said God makes all values, and now the atheist still believes that, but puts God into the human mind, right? And just say, well, it's humans who do it all. And it's like, no, humans were brought into being by a process that preceded us, and we're going to be gone. And the best science certainly today points to the complexity occurring and increasing all across the universe. Planets are everywhere, and who knows if life is everywhere, but it's the same chemistry everywhere on Alpha Centauri as it is on Earth. So it's the same physical laws that are operating. So anyway, yeah, I think the universe is just engaged in an enormous value producing computation, and our universe is just one of infinitely many universes. So that's a Platonic approach to those questions about value.
Wow, it's even blown my mind more to listen directly from you. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
It's very good. So yeah, I love this. Good and evil. Evil is something about relational, right? So, but anyway, so we got rid of um, God. We get rid God from many ultimate explanations, morality, beings, and stuffs. But anyways, I have questions about like uh, maybe some people still, how could I put it? Like they're missing the religious way of life aspect in religion, right? So can I say that, uh, as you put in your book, that this atheistic Platonism also propose something as a way of life, like the way you put it, there is uh, theurgies, theurgies that you talk
Oh
in the
yeah.
chapter. Well, yeah, can you elaborate more about this atheistic Platonism as a way of life?
Yeah, sure. Ancient, particularly Roman Platonists, like Plotinus a little bit, but certainly people more like Porphyry, and then especially Iamblichus, right? They thought about this thing that they called theurgy, and it's initially kind of in a quasi-religious way of thinking about human bodies and human selves. Um, as Plato has this place, several places where he says that humans should try to become divine. Right, our job is, our purpose, our task in life is to become as divine as possible. And for the ancients, right, the gods are bodies, right? For Plato, most of the gods are the sun, the moon, the stars are literally divine bodies. Other Platonists think that, like Homer or Hesiod, that Athena is this superhuman animal, right? She's not some disembodied spirit. I mean, she's a superhuman animal. Same with Zeus and the rest of them. And so, okay, we should try to become divine. We should optimize our bodies. And the ancient Platonists like Plotinus and Iamblichus are really the first to start to think about. Then it's very primitive, it's obscure, but it's applying the sort of scientific method and procedures to your own body. And they interpret this, they don't really have good health science. They don't know much about how the body works in, the year 400 AD. Um, but they start to have these ideas of applying practices and procedures to the body, things that you do with your body, rituals and ways of, and some of this comes from Pythagoras, right? Ways of measuring the body, right? Ways of thinking about the body mathematically. And for them, at first, this is like involves rituals with cubes and spheres and stuff. And it might seem very obscure, but it's the start of a way, anybody who has a smartwatch or a Fitbit, or a way of counting their steps or taking their blood pressure or, blood sugar and insulin levels. You're doing what they were talking about, right? So with modern medical knowledge and modern technologies, we can quantify the body, we can measure our bodies, and we now have all sorts of medical technologies, medicines, molecules, also just procedures and devices we can apply to our bodies to make us healthier, to enhance our bodies, to help us to live longer and be, smarter and faster, and all those, optimal conditions of health and wellness, and even enhancing our bodies. So that Platonic project of theurgy, right, which the theurgy means to try to become divine, right? That gets taken up by the transhumanists, right? Transhumanists say we should use technology and science to transform ourselves into deities. And one can argue, some of that is controversial and debatable, what they mean by that. They're not often clear. But that transhumanist project is just theurgy, right? If you were to take a transhumanist back to ancient Rome, to Iamblichus, he'd be like, oh, you're doing theurgy, right? You're trying to transform human body. And that gets into artificial intelligence and robotics and things like that. And I always like to say that, the ancient Platonists, they're the first ones who are into artificial intelligence. I mean, the gods are AIs, right? It's like, and it's not necessarily that they're just AIs made by us, artificial, but if you're talking about intelligence as being like a matrix of numbers organized into a network, like large language models, I mean, that could just be a chapter from Plotinus, I mean, yeah, he doesn't know about computers, but he knows about mathematics, right? And he's got the idea that, intelligence emerges from mathematical structure, right? And the way that numbers work together is what gives you mind. And so you've got a lot of these basic ideas about, computing, artificial intelligence, transforming our bodies into greater bodies, or just creating new types of life, new types of intelligence on our planet and in the physical universe. So yeah, I think theurgy and a way of life is a way of thinking about transformation. It's a way of thinking about transforming our bodies and our societies, try to make our societies more just, more fair, more equitable, more virtuous, right? Because Platonism is always oriented towards the good, right? And the good is not God either, right? The one's not God, the good is not God. They're two different things, and they interact. So maybe that helps a little with theurgy.
Yeah, it is. It is. So I think it's. I have uh, enough questions from directly the book itself, but I want to go with the question from one of the audience.
Sure.
So yeah, it's interesting one. So, in your opinion, why atheistic Platonism is better than Christianity?
Sure. I'd be a little cautious about the word better, right? I mean, I don't, it's, I'm pretty skeptical about saying like one religion is better than another or one culture is better than another. I mean, it's an alternative. Because atheistic Platonism or just Platonism itself is going to have its own flaws and its own, vices and problems, right? And we're all human. So when you get a bunch of humans together and they become Christians, you get problems. You get political problems, ethical
Yeah.
problems, or Muslims or Buddhists or Hindus or any group at all, or atheists. It's still going to be humans and it's still going to have human flaws. I think Platonism provides us with an alternative. One of the things I like about Platonism is, okay, everything comes from the one, but the one branches out into many. And so Platonism has a real value of diversity, right? So in Platonism, you don't have one God, you have many. There's many
Mm,
divine beings.
mm,
There are ways for men to be perfect, women to be perfect, right? For all the different racial and ethnic groups. No one is, perfection is multiple. No particular way of life is given a supreme value, except insofar as it pursues the good. But monotheism, I think, has one particular danger, which is it reduces everything to one very narrow and specific concept of, perfection is just one way. And certainly in the United States, you find that becomes racialized. It becomes involved in all kinds of forms of injustice, because if you don't correspond to that one way, you must be evil. And a Platonist doesn't look at that, doesn't look at things that way at all, right? In a certain sort of trivial sense, we try to look for the good in everyone, and don't say like, oh, well, you don't have the right beliefs, therefore you're evil, right? You're going to hell. And so there's going to be, I hope, less violence, right? Because you start to think that people are doing absolutely evil things that are going to lead all of us to hell, you can be violent towards them. And that violence certainly appears in American culture. So I hope that a Platonic way of life is going to be a way of life that has a higher value of diversity, of men and women, different ethnic and racial groups, and is much less violent, right? It's much more tolerant. That's my hope. It's but humans are going to bring human problems into it. It's not utopia.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, we should be careful with the term better, but you think it proposes a more diverse way to interact with the world and
Yeah.
artistic platonism.
Yeah, I mean, if I see like, there's people there and they are doing different kinds of practices, I'm not going to say, oh, they're evil and they're going to hell and I have to stop them, right? I'm going to try to understand them, right? And
Yeah.
Platonism gives you a big framework to try to, both theists and atheists in the West, right? And this is Western cultural arrogance. When you see, like, let's say shamanic practices, right? I mean, the theists will say, oh, they're satanic, they're evil, they're bad, they have to stop. But the atheists say the same thing. They just use sort of different language, but they say like, oh, they're stupid, they're foolish, they're irrational and superstitious. It's like they just agree, right? The atheists might not use the satanic language, but and it's like, wait a minute, you guys are both wrong. You should look at what the people are doing. Look at what goodness they're trying to achieve and try to understand them. And, try to like not just see what's good in it, but to see how this is human. This is human life at
Yeah.
work culturally. It's not evil. It's not stupid. Now, humans do evil things for sure. But instead of looking at unusual practices and saying they're evil or they're stupid, one of the things I never liked about atheism is constantly saying other people are stupid. And I was like, no, learn to love humans. So,
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you. Very interesting. It's already an hour. I have
sure,
one last questions,
sure.
Eric. So it is my observation. So I read your books, and then you said there were four Platonic ultimates: matter, the one, the divine mind, and the good. And we don't want in the atheistic Platonists won't say that the divine mind is God, right? It's another stuff. But my question is it right to put that atheistic Platonism is some kind of polytheism? Like we believe in many ultimates and divine beings, polytheism, quote unquote. Yeah, is it is it
Okay.
right to put it that way?
Well, I wouldn't say polytheism, right? Because that's a kind of theism, right? And polytheism itself was, so the ancient indigenous peoples in Europe didn't think they were polytheists. Um, that's a Christian term too. I mean, there were many gods and goddesses. There were many divine beings, right? The world is full of divine beings. And yeah, try to find all the divine beings in the universe. There's lots of them. And maybe in our universe, okay, maybe in the next universe there'll be more. So, but the point I think you're pointing to that's valuable for the Platonist is pluralism, plurality, right?
Yeah,
Pragmatic
yeah.
value pluralism. There are many ways to be perfect, not just one way. There isn't just one maximally perfect being. There's absolutely infinitely many maximally perfect beings. And that's what the one, as the one develops towards the good, right, it expands into multiplicity, grows more valuable, greater perfections, and ultimately there's just going to be infinitely many, absolutely infinitely many maximally perfect beings, right? Each one of which there's going to be maximally perfect birds, you know. Anything that's a form of complexity can keep getting more complex. And so there you go.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, it's answered. It's really answered my questions. But so yeah, it's already 1 hour and five
Sure.
minutes. So I'm gonna stop asking you more
Yep.
questions. Yeah, it's still early in the morning and it's late in the night. So wanna thank you for being here. Thank you for taking your time to talk with us this interesting perspective of atheistic platonism.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. Sure.
Yeah. So
And
yeah,
thanks for doing a philosophy show and getting people interested in all these topics.
yeah. I hope people getting more interested in Indonesia. I'm gonna speak in Indonesian first to close the
Sure.
sessions. Jadi teman-teman, thank you udah bersama-sama kami selama 1 jam 6 menit. Kita akan bertemu lagi di lain waktu bersama Erik dan ya terima kasih banyak buat Erik yang sudah menemani kita selama waktu ini. Kita bertemu lagi di lain waktu. So yeah, see you soon everyone and thankful for with us for the past 1 hour.